Welcome to the 2024 BSHM Webinar and Pointer Lecture. My name is Edward Babazinzak. It is my privilege to be the current president of the British Society for the History of Medicine, and it is my pleasure to host this event. We are gratified to have so many BSHM members from around the UK and much further afield join us today. And we warmly welcome all of you who may be less familiar with our society. You can find out more about us by going to our website at bshm.org.uk. Our first speaker is Dr. Agnes Arnold-Forster, who is a historian of medicine and the emotions and is currently a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. She has written extensively about the history of cancer, surgery, reproductive health, vaccines, pandemics, the NHS, and nostalgia. The most recent of her 3 books is titled Nostalgia, A History of a Dangerous Emotion. Today, Agnes will address nostalgia and the National Health Service.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so as mentioned, I'm a historian of healthcare, and I am today going to be talking about, I suppose, a combination of 2 things that I'm very interested in. One is nostalgia, and the other is the NHS, and particularly the kind of emotional cultures, both within the NHS and about the NHS. So, yeah, melding the kind of history of medicine with the history of emotions. So in 2012, the London Olympic Games opening ceremony mythologized the foundation of the NHS and used the service as a symbol of British national identity. And it wasn't the first to do this. It wasn't the first thing to kind of cement the NHS as something more than just a health service, something central to, I mentioned, the nation's identity, a key site of interaction between the public and the state, and the country's largest single employer. As the one-time Conservative MP Nigel Lawson put it, the National Health Service is the closest thing the English have to a religion. And in his kind of portrayal of the health service, which he sits in this sort of big narrative arc of British history, the director, Danny Boyle, drew on very nostalgic images of a bygone era of healthcare. And you can see this in the images here that, you know, you have nurses in kind of 1950s dress, clearly kind of antiquated furniture from the health service of days gone by. And these nurses were played by actual staff members of Great Ormond Street Hospital, and he pitted these staff members against multiple villains from children's literature, including the child catcher, Cruella de Vil, and Lord Voldemort. And several people at the time kind of commented whether these villains were supposed to embody maybe NHS managers, maybe Tory politicians. The jury's still out, and Danny Boyle never quite admitted it, but that's a sort of part of the kind of sort of story that Boyle was telling. But as I mentioned, nostalgia is not limited to this particular instance of kind of national commemoration or celebration. And instead, nostalgia permeates all sorts of cultural representations of the health service and is threaded through many of the ways that we as people, as both sort of citizens, as patients, but also as staff, relate to the health service. This is a still from Call the Midwife. And I think a lot of our kind of collective shared images of the health service come from this sort of golden age of the NHS's history, the kind of post-war period. And you see this all the time in kind of media coverage of the health service. So for example, in 2018, this was a kind of bit of local news, a patient at Bassetlaw Hospital and Worksop entertained staff with anecdotes of his time spent as a chef at the site in the 1950s. He regaled his doctors and nurses with stories from what he described as the good old days, remembering how he would bake 300 cakes a day for all the patients and at weekends make one for each individual ward. He harked back to a bygone era of hospital life, a time when doctors and nurses had their own dining rooms and when matron and her maid were served tea in her study. And this kind of like happy reflection, which is kind of used to sort of promote hospital life and to kind of promote the kind of local culture, local identity of a hospital and of the NHS more broadly. Nostalgia is also regularly used as part of things like social media campaigns or fundraising campaigns, often designed to save our NHS from underfunding and government caprice. So for example, a Twitter user, or I suppose now an X user, called Sue, with hashtag NHS Love in her username, tweeted in 2022, quote, "If people don't wake up soon and come to their senses, the NHS will be history. Workers' rights will be the good old days. The gap between the haves and have-nots will be beyond measure. There will be no social services and no social care." And nostalgic lines of attack are often used to levy critique at the current state of the NHS. So, for example, the domestic cleaner Rona McFarlane has worked at Whipps Cross Hospital for 32 years. And she insisted also in 2022 that the good old days of the NHS are in the past. Under the NHS, she says, you felt proud to help people. And in those days, you had the time to talk to patients. She said then, if a nurse was busy and a patient needed a glass of orange juice, you could just go and get it for them, as long as you asked the nurse first, of course. Now, she goes on to say, things have changed. You are so busy now that you don't have time to listen. 60-year-old Rona first came to the UK from Jamaica in 1961. She settled in East London and started her public sector career almost immediately. But as she sort of sees it, with the outsourcing of hospitals' cleaning services, her role has since contracted, has now been contracted out to an external private company. And she's seen her role change from a public servant working as part of what she calls the NHS family to becoming an employee of a company primarily interested in profit. On the 5th of July in 2018, the NHS turned 70. It's since turned 75, but sit with 70 for the time being. And celebrations were held at hospitals across the country. The NHS Tayside in Scotland shared information about their commemorations on their website. As the much-loved institution turns 70 on the 5th of July, NHS Tayside is encouraging everyone to join in the celebrations that have been planned to mark this historic occasion. Staff and visitors were invited to visit their Trip Down Memory Lane display. Quote, if you want to see some of the old hospitals again or reminisce about the good old days, then this nostalgic photographic display is definitely not to be missed. So I've just given a few kind of little tidbits, little examples here of how nostalgia kind of crops up in almost any kind of coverage, any kind of conversation about the NHS, in efforts to kind of save it, protect it, to promote it, but also in just kind of general reminiscence. But to go back to Danny Boyle briefly, Danny Boyle saw this representation of the NHS, his sort of nostalgic vision of the NHS, as unproblematic, as a positive thing. And he was quite straightforward about it. He said, one of the reasons we put the NHS in the show is that everyone is aware of how important the NHS is to everybody in this country. That nostalgia is a sign or a symbol of the kind of deep emotional feeling that people have for the health service. And for most people, I think they wouldn't see anything particularly troubling about this kind of nostalgia. They'd see, okay, well, what's wrong with a bit of, warm, fuzzy feeling about something that we value so dearly? But for some people, this emotional and nostalgic portrayal of the NHS, particularly using London 2012 as an example, was a troubling obstacle to healthy critique and reform. In an article published in the Mail on Sunday in 2012, the journalist Ian Birrell decried those who elevated doctors to deities, deemed our health service sacrosanct, and argued that those who possessed a misty-eyed myopia about the NHS prevented real reform. He lambasted the dancing doctors, the nurses in their old-fashioned uniforms, the cute children bouncing on 300 luminous beds that spelt out those sacred three letters, NHS. It's worth noting that Birrell has a particular kind of political perspective. He was a speechwriter for David Cameron, but he's kind of occupied a range of different kind of idiosyncratic opinions. So he's a bit difficult to neatly pigeonhole into one political identity or another. But he was pretty hard line about what he saw as the problems of sort of NHS nostalgia. And he suggested that Britain's sentimentality over its health system was a damaging and ultimately self-defeating national tragedy. Following a painstaking account of NHS failings and distressing personal stories of suffering, Birrell argued that this is the legacy of pumping vast sums of money into an anachronistic system, of a culture of bureaucratic targets and box ticking, of insisting nurses must be graduates and allowing doctors to become deified, and of politicians too timid to know to do what they know is right. And I do actually really recommend reading this article because it is incredibly powerfully made case for why Britain seems to be locked into this stultifying emotional relationship with its health service. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, it's kind of really interesting read, and I'm sure it's available somewhere still. But yeah, it's a fascinating take on some of these kinds of emotional cultures. So just to kind of drill down into what I mean when I talk about nostalgia, why I think nostalgia is an interesting and important thing to think about, especially when it comes to something like the NHS. So psychologists have found nostalgia, especially recently, relatively easy to describe, identify, and locate on the brain scans of study participants. And Konstantin Stadikides defines nostalgic narratives as, and I quote, predominantly fond, personally meaningful, and rosy memories of childhood or close relationships, as well as keepsakes and familiar sensory cues. So for psychologists like Konstantin Stadikides, nostalgia is a sort of stable scientific category, an emotional state that has particular kind of valences and particular identities. And even in kind of a common sense way, that a lot of that will feel familiar to us. It will feel familiar to the kind of emotional investment so many of us will experience when they think about when we think about the past. And for psychologists today, nostalgia serves a range of personal and psychological functions. It has evolved as part of our kind of emotional armor, and it has the capacity to promote perceptions of friendship and social support, nurture sentiments of protection and love, lower attachment avoidance, attachment anxiety, engender a sense of interpersonal competence, prompt pro-social behavior, and improve attitudes towards outgroups, as well as strengthen the desire for intergroup contact. So that long quote contains a lot of kind of psychological terminology, but fundamentally what they're saying is that this is, you know, a positive force in our inner emotional lives. It has a really powerful and important role to play in the way that we feel, can do things like ameliorate anxiety, lessen depression, make us feel more closely connected to the people around us. It's a bittersweet emotion, sure. There's kind of, it's tinged with longing and regret, but it's usually more sweet than bitter. But while the feeling of nostalgia might be very pleasurable for the individual experiencing it, its reputation as the more collective emotion, as something more political, is not so honeyed. Indeed, the instrumentalization of nostalgia has been blamed for a range of perceived social and political sins. From Brexit to Donald Trump's famous call to make America great again, some left-wing commentators specifically have decried recent populist movements for their nostalgic appeals to a mythic bygone age, an age they imply that was far less racially diverse, had far fewer women in the public sphere, and maintained an imperialist and colonial inflection. These more kind of polemic accusations are mirrored by some social science research into nostalgia. So, for example, the sociologist Yanis Gabriel called nostalgia the latest opiate of the people. And in the context of social, political, or organizational transformation, like the NHS, a nostalgic idealization of the past can be employed to demonize the present by those who seek to resist change. So this is that kind of other side, I suppose, of nostalgia's reputation. So not just the kind of warm, fuzzy, personally meaningful feeling, but something that has the capacity to prevent people from looking ahead, being forward moving, being kind of trapped in the past, indulging in, you know, a kind of mythic, rose-tinted vision of what the past, you know, they think it ought to have been like, very different from what the past actually was, preventing the kind of reform, radical change that some people might think that society needs. But there is a small and growing literature, and I hope that my book falls into this category, that provides a more nuanced consideration of the emotion. So the sociologist in the 1970s, this is not so recent, he defined nostalgia as a positively toned evocation of a lived past. But he saw it, and he was one of the earliest to kind of think of it in these terms, as a productive emotion with the capacity to generate individual, social, and political change. So quite unlike, I suppose, that more kind of stultifying ostrich sort of head in the sand kind of feeling that the kind of critics of Donald Trump supporters might have us believe. He wrote, "It is one of the means at our disposal of the never-ending work of constructing, maintaining, and reconstructing our identities." And he's not alone. So more recently, still, the sociology of emotion of organizations has sought to reinterpret nostalgia, rather than seeing it as a fundamentally kind of small c conservative emotion. These studies instead suggest that nostalgia represents what they call a discursive recourse that can be selectively deployed as a weapon in the armory of those seeking to drive through changes. So again, very different from that kind of stultifying conservative feeling. And it is this notion of nostalgia as an emotion with the capacity to reform that I'm going to talk about a bit more here. So this paper draws on a very long-standing interest in nostalgia, and found its sort of origins in oral history interviews that I conducted with UK-based surgeons and some other hospital consultants, but alongside written source material. And together, I think that we can use them to suggest that we can see nostalgia not just as a kind of rose-tinted vision of a static past that ignores the realities of the 21st century world and workforce, but instead as a creative tool that could be deployed as part of that broad arsenal of reform. And my claims are kind of informed by some of this sort of social science research, by kind of the public professional commentary and journalism, and on these interviews that I conducted with doctors. And one of the things that that kind of really struck me when I embarked on this research, I was working on a project that was looked at the place of emotion in modern British surgery, in contemporary British surgery. And when I started these interviews, I expected to find a lot of big feelings about the kind of gravity of life and death that surgeons encounter in their day-to-day lives. So patient suffering, the kind of grief of terrible decisions, of loss, of the sort of pain of holding other people's lives in their hands. And there was some of that. But there was also a huge amount of other stuff, other feelings that really came to the fore. And some of those feelings were like, I suppose, relatively mundane, but although very familiar and very important. So things like frustration, boredom, being irritated by rotas, not being able to get the annual leave you want, having to fill out paperwork that was tedious, the kind of irritations of your colleagues, things that are very familiar to anyone who works in any organisation of any kind, and I think probably especially familiar to those who work in the NHS. These sorts of emotions really kind of dominated the conversations, and I had to kind of pivot my research interest slightly away from these kind of big high feelings of still patient death and towards the kind of more day-to-day, the more quotidian feelings of hospital life. And nostalgia played a huge part in that, and a huge part of that nostalgia was directed towards a world that they saw that was less encumbered by these sorts of day-to-day frustrations. And the way I see it is, well, there's loads of really great research, historical research on the high feelings of healthcare work, of that kind of patient death, kind of loss, grief, turmoil. But the things that I'm interested in, or one of the things that I'm interested in, are the emotions of healthcare labor, of healthcare work, of seeing healthcare work as work, not just something that's different and distinctive and has its own kind of, sort of gravitas to it. I'm also interested really in paperwork, which, maybe isn't as fashionable or sort of sexy, but is, I think, a very important part of the professional life of healthcare workers. And so to go back in time a little bit into where I think the kind of hinge point for some of this nostalgia lies, and to make this very clear, nostalgia predates Tony Blair in the NHS. You don't have to spend very much time in the NHS archive to know that nostalgia was everywhere in the 60s, in the 70s, even the kind of golden age of the NHS that we now consider, that kind of post-war period. If you look at what doctors and nurses were saying then, they were themselves very nostalgic. Maybe for the first few years of the NHS, maybe for the 1950s if they're working in 1970s, or maybe for a pre-NHS era. And so, this isn't new to the 21st century, but a lot of the people I spoke to, a lot of the people I interviewed reflected on this moment specifically, when in 1997, Tony Blair won his landslide election for Labour, and his party brought in a white paper called The New NHS, Modern, Dependable, which fundamentally transformed the way hospital doctors work. And it did all sorts of things. Some things I'm sure people in this sort of virtual room who actually worked through these changes will have a much better understanding of than I do. But one of the things that it did was it brought in a new consideration of the European Working Time Directive. And the European Working Time Directive, or the EWTD, proposed a 48-hour working week, which entered law in the European Union in 1998. And the UK was then a part of the European Union, and a phased approach to implementation was agreed for doctors in training in the UK, which steadily reduced working hours to 58 in 2004, 56 in 2007, and 48 in 2009. And a key component of the EWTD was that the maximum period of work for a resident without rest is 13 hours in theory. And this was part of a whole kind of parcel of new Labour healthcare policies that were concerning to some hospital doctors and prompted a range of nostalgic responses. So while the new Labour reforms were about newness and modernisation and the future, these this kind of vision wasn't readily acquiesced to by hospital doctors themselves, and many of them saw the introduction of the EWTD as a negative turning point, as something that meant that so much of what they valued about the NHS, what they valued about their working lives, was on the decline. So prior to the introduction of the EWTD, surgeons specifically, but also other hospital doctors, trained as part of a firm, a hierarchical structure of senior and less senior practitioners. And many of those people that I interviewed attested to the supportive nature of this team approach and argued that they could cope with excessively long working hours, partly because they were maintained by a sense of camaraderie and mutual understanding. So one male pediatric surgeon who was born in 1944 that I interviewed described when he first qualified in the late 60s and early 70s, more than 100-hour working weeks were normal. In his first job, he had no official time off, and leave was usually arranged informally with his consultant. The consultant would usually say yes to requests unless things were very busy or had some very sick patients, and then they would just all have to stay there until things were under control. The interview reflected how very different this experience was to how it had become now. And I asked him whether there were any positives to his working life then. And on the whole, he said he was quite happy that I lived through that old era. In the old system, he said, you felt very much like you were part of the firm. Whatever you were doing, you were definitely working within the team. And that gave a very strong feeling of belonging and commitment. He developed close relationships with his colleagues, superiors, juniors, who all trusted him. And he says, I think if I look at all the surgical bosses I had, I think I worked well with them because I was sort of around all the time and they got to trust me. By contrast, towards the end of his consultant career in the late 1990s and early 2000s, after the introduction of the EWTD, he did get a bit irritated at the restrictions placed on our trainees and felt that they weren't around when they should have been. Nowadays, people are on rotas, and you don't get that continuity. He argued that these new rotas negatively affected the quality of teaching and training. Sometimes you hardly know your trainees, he said, and it's very difficult to impart a philosophy of practice if you hardly see them. He finished by saying, I think I was lucky to be brought up in that old era. I'm a supporter of how it was then, more than I am now, and I think a lot of old people feel that way. He said he was old, not me, just to clarify. And this, I did quite a small study here, and the experience that was pretty consistent, and multiple people referenced the EWTD by name as the kind of moment where their professional lives had changed for the worse. But it's also represented by much broader kind of research I've done into journalism, but also other kinds of social science research done into how people feel about how their working lives have shifted over the millennium. So this is a quote from the BMJ from 2000. And again, the author here is reflecting on the good old days when doctors and nurses worked together rather than parallel. This is also kind of a theme that comes across that community, although the firm is, for clinical staff, the firm, that kind of feeling of community and camaraderie could extend across the clinical workforce. So survey data published in the BMJ in 2014 demonstrated the EWTD was still being talked about all the time and had, as people saw, increased tensions, particularly between junior doctors and their senior colleagues. And some consultants indicated they felt beleaguered by carrying some of the workload which used in the pre-EWTD era to be undertaken by their junior doctors. Moreover, some of the senior doctors surveyed were found to be concerned that the rotas introduced to comply with the working time restrictions had eroded the professionalism of junior doctors and promoted a clocking off attitude. So the kind of critiques go both ways. And there are, of course, problems with this kind of nostalgic thinking. It's a rose-tinted vision of history, one that obscures negative experiences and memories. And some social science researchers have seen this as a kind of gendered form of othering, something about heralding the positives of long working days was something that that cost women's careers specifically and people with caring responsibilities, and that kind of nostalgia diminishes that sort of the kind of problems of that old era. And critics of nostalgia argue that the emotion misrepresents an unpleasant past, and they are in many ways correct. Histories of surgeries, including my own, and the hospital care in the halcyon days of pre-EWTD reveal a hierarchical, often very male-dominated, and often very exhausting system that relied on sometimes nepotism and the wives who performed the household labour and childcare that allowed their husbands to work uninterrupted. And the firm system, while lauded by many, was also critiqued by several surgeons I interviewed, and particularly by female practitioners who argued that it was a macho culture with little time or space for emotional reflection, women, or family life. So this is a female general surgeon born in 1970 who I interviewed, who got a very dismissive attitude, who talked a lot about the very dismissive attitudes of her colleagues, and particularly the sort of little space that there was made for her life outside hospital walls. And even that same male pediatric surgeon, the one born in 1944, the one who waxed lyrical about working in the 1960s and 70s, I asked him whether there are any cons to that old era, and he did admit that he got very tired. And that while he had 6 children, none of them had chosen to go into medicine. And he'd reflected that he'd perhaps not been the best father to them, saying, "It destroys your home life." But I think still we can see nostalgia as more than just a rose-tinted vision of a static past. And I'm not alone in thinking this. The writer Svetlana Boyne suggests nostalgia has a utopian dimension, and that while nostalgia and progress are like Jekyll and Hyde, they are at least 2 sides of the same coin. And I think that when other surgeons who talked about this say, well, the problem is not so much that, I'm not fossilized in a particular mode. I'm not someone that's just a kind of dinosaur. I just see real problems with the way the NHS works now. And I see this kind of nostalgic reflection as a way to kind of resist governmental notions of modernization, managerialism, reform. And you can see nostalgia not just as a kind of like small c conservatism, but an expression of profound dissatisfaction with current working conditions. And while working conditions were not necessarily better before the 1990s, and different people had very different experiences of those working conditions, depending on their gender, race, and position in the hospital hierarchy, those who felt the old era and the firm worked well lamented the loss of easily available support for the emotional intensity of clinical labour. They mourned the loss of an emotional community. And various interviews commented on how informal support networks within the surgical profession and the hospital had, over the past 30 years, collapsed. Indeed, often what people were nostalgic for was not just longer working hours, better trained juniors, less bureaucracy, and limited managerial control, but a different kind of emotional landscape, one that offers the support, care, and camaraderie required in a pressurized and sometimes traumatic workplace. And so to finish, the current conversation about the conditions of the NHS workforce is often trapped between 2 diametrically opposed positions: a kind of nostalgic preoccupation with how much better it once was, and a focus on the individual as solely responsible for their emotional well-being. And this second position involves an unhealthy obsession with ideas about resilience and replaces the responsibility for being resilient with the individual rather than seeking change from institutions and governments. It offers piecemeal solutions to stress, burnout, and overwork, such as lunchtime yoga classes and mindfulness apps, but fails to acknowledge the structural and resourcing shortfalls that necessitate long working hours and inadequate formalized support networks. These initiatives implore employees to sleep better, do more exercise, take up soothing hobbies. In other words, it demands NHS workers to have a good work-life balance without offering them the supportive communities, meaningful labour, or autonomy that this transformed lifestyle requires. That's why we might not want to indulge all of the nostalgic demands made by hospital doctors and return to a hierarchical, male-dominated world of all hours working. There might be aspects of this nostalgia that offers a more radical counterweight to the modernisation agenda of the present day. Thank you. This is my book, available in all good bookstores.
Agnes, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture about something that is a very fundamental human emotion and yet has such complexity that I think few of us realize how important it must be, and also how important a role it has played and no doubt continues to play in the NHS. I have an immediate question for you, and that is nostalgia being damaged by frustration of failure of the NHS?
I'd love to know more about what you mean by that, or what you have in mind by that question, because I think, if anything, nostalgia is being elevated by frustration of failure of the NHS. I think that nostalgia is often driven by a sense that the NHS of the present is lacking in some way, and a perhaps flawed assumption that the NHS of the past was so much better. I mean, I would say that, a lot of what I'm talking about here is trying to kind of think more expansively, more kind of positively about nostalgia, more kind of, not to say it has no flaws as a feeling, but to say that it can also be used to do positive things, or can be used to kind of promote positive things. But I do think it is important to note that, as a historian of the NHS, I'm in a relatively good place to know that the 1950s and sort of 60s were not without their problems. And as I mentioned in the talk, there's plenty of nostalgia in those decades, 4 decades before. But I think one of the things that's really important to kind of know about nostalgia is that nostalgia isn't really about the past. It's tempting to see it as something that's about the past because it's so much, there's so much pastness in it. People talk about the past all the time when they're being nostalgic. But it kind of is irrelevant what the past is or what actually happened. Nostalgia, I think, is so much more about it's sort of a sort of siphon, or kind of a valve for kind of expressing anxieties and concerns about the present. And so often when you are looking, when you look for nostalgia through history, it's a very useful kind of indicator for moments and kind of things that a society are particularly preoccupied with. So when you see a kind of real nostalgia for a certain moment in the past, it can help sort of point you in the direction of what that society at that time most values. And I think that there's so much NHS nostalgia, partly because there is so much intense emotional investment in the health service. Whether we think that emotional investment is a good thing, I mean, Ian Birrell at the beginning of my talk definitely doesn't think it's a good thing. And I personally have some reservations, but we can't deny it's there. I think there is a kind of an argument that emotional intensity is slightly waning, partly as a product of quite how challenging some aspects of the health service now are. But I would still say that we know from survey data that people still have a huge amount of trust and loyalty and investment in the health service, and that doesn't seem to be going anywhere with any kind of rapidity, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think that, I mean, yeah, as I said, I'd love to know more about what you're thinking of there, because I feel like maybe there's more behind the question. But
yeah, that was one of the questions that came through to me to ask to you, so I won't elaborate on it any further. As we have a little bit of time, I wondered if you might like to talk a little bit about the origins of nostalgia in history, because that's also very interesting. It has changed, I guess, quite substantially since the concept came about.
Absolutely. So I got into nostalgia sort of via the NHS, via my work on the NHS, but then much of the book is about nostalgia's history as a disease. So for much of the nostalgia was first coined at the end of the 17th century. For the kind of first 300 years of its history as a term, as a thing, it was a disease that had the capacity to kill people. And so when my book is subtitled A History of a Dangerous Emotion, I mean that quite literally. It was often recorded as the cause of death in all sorts of circumstances, both militarily and in civic cases. What it was actually killing people is a kind of open, I think, unknowable question. But again, the thing that I was sort of very interested in is, well, what do people mean when they say nostalgia? Even if it's not the thing that's actually killing people, like what does that tell us about what people are concerned about? And one of the things I argue in the book is that the nostalgia emerges at a time when people are feeling increasingly insecure about the pace of change of life, about I suppose the coming of modernity and the coming of kind of globalization. One of the things that's distinctive about kind of early modern nostalgia compared with nostalgia today is that then it was more of a kind of a pathological homesickness, a preoccupation with place rather than time. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it shifts. I can see that there are some questions in the Q&A. Should I go through some of those?
Yeah, shall I read them for you? So politicians are consistently trying to reform the NHS. Are they lacking in nostalgia, and could this be damaging?
I think to answer that very simply, yes. And that's partly because I'm biased and I'm a historian. I think history is very useful. The past is a very useful resource for finding potentially like positive things for the future. And I think it can be very easy to get overly kind of progressivist, kind of, buy into some of the narratives of like Silicon Valley and like tech bros that the only way to improve the world is by relying on increasingly rapacious technology and, you know, AI and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that those things have no place in the reform of our public services, but I do think that some of the things that need to be changed about the NHS are quite simple and quite kind of and can be found in the past. So one of the things that I found constantly when I was talking to doctors was that one of the things that they made their lives a lot worse was the lack of adequate rest and social spaces within hospitals. And that's pretty simple, really. I mean, there are complex reasons why these things have been gradually eroded, but in some ways that's a very straightforward solution or part solution to some of the problems of the health service. And I think that one of the things that that perhaps politicians are not so good at is looking to the past to mine it for useful solutions for the present, and also for trying to kind of, you know, solve kind of complex problems with complex solutions rather than thinking, okay, well, are there simple solutions to some of these complex issues?
Thank you. I've got 3 more questions. So just very quickly, the first is, does nostalgia vary in degrees according to different specialties?
That's a very good question. So I can't speak with a huge amount of confidence about different specialties, whether that's like beyond the boundaries of surgery, because the kind of in-depth research I did was into surgeons. I will say that there didn't seem to be, in my kind of admittedly quite small sample, much significant variation between different specialties. And that, but although I do want to flag that there are big differences in the kind of cultural norms of different, I mean, this is, again, if anyone here has worked with any in the NHS or with any kind of healthcare professional of any kind, they'll know this already, but that there are big kind of, whether or not those are real distinctions between individual humans or whether they are kind of sort of stereotypes or sort of mythologies about different subspecialties. And so it wouldn't surprise me that much if a much larger study than the one I was able to conduct did find kind of distinctions between different subspecialties and their kind of nostalgic tendencies. But I would also say that like that there didn't seem to be much distinction between much correlation with age and nostalgia. Young people, even, you know, really early in their career, junior doctors were also often very nostalgic, which I think is again further evidence that nostalgia is not so much about the past, but more about your kind of contemporary frustrations. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And just briefly, if you could, is there any correlation with class and race and expressions of nostalgia?
Yeah, so sort of 2 answers to that question. So I did find that there was some more nostalgia among male surgeons and more nostalgia among white surgeons than there were among surgeons of color and women. But again, it's a very small study, so I can't say that with like, you know, I can't make that as a kind of big claim. But what I will say is that when they do big sort of national or international surveys of nostalgia, there isn't a huge amount of correlation between political identity, between ethnicity, between gender and nostalgia. There's some slight variations, but not as much as perhaps we might expect, which I think is quite an interesting kind of finding. And one thing I'll also say is that one of the things about nostalgia is it kind of captures people. So I had this really interesting conversation with actually a GP who said, I met her and she was really nostalgic about her training time. She was like, oh, and it was so, you know, the good old days, all the sort of stuff that I've just been talking about. And then she kind of got back in contact with me a few weeks later and says, you know, I've found this article I wrote for my sort of, you know, professional journal back in the 80s when I was training. And I was miserable. She says, I completely misrepresented to you and to myself all these things about my past working life. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of, again, quite sort of interesting about nostalgia is it's also has a social function. And so when you're around other people who are being nostalgic, you also tend to become more nostalgic yourself. And so nostalgia can kind of cut across these like kind of social, cultural, ethnic, class lines, because once you're part of the same community, you will share in the same sort of nostalgia.
Thank you. And in one line, if you can, are we more nostalgic here about our health system than people in other countries?
Again, I can't say this with any kind of like scientific certainty, but I will say that I think that that Britain has a very unusual and arguably unique emotional relationship with its health service. Lots of other countries in the world have very effective, efficient, free at the point of access healthcare systems, and they don't have the same sort of mythology of their health service. It's hard to imagine the health system of France, say, cropping up in the kind of Paris opening ceremony. It did not. So yeah, I think yes, I think we are
That's
more
great.
weird.
Thank you very much. There are some other questions, but I'm afraid we don't have more time to deal with them at present. Thanks again, Agnes, for a very interesting and detailed and well illustrated presentation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. So if we can now move on to our second guest today. Cara McGugan is an award-winning journalist. She's published articles in many leading newspapers and periodicals and is the Telegraph's first narrative audio journalist. She's the author of Bed of Lies, a documentary podcast series which investigates major British scandals. And her debut book is The Poison Line: Life and Death in the Infected Blood Scandal. Today, Cara will talk about investigating the UK infected blood scandal by addressing some key questions. So, Cara, thank you so much for joining us from the US in your morning and our early evening. The infected blood story was across news media in the UK earlier this year. For those who are not familiar with the background, could you tell us about the origins of the problem, please?
Yes, so the infected blood scandal, the part I'm going to be talking about today, affected people with haemophilia. There are two sort of strands to the infected blood scandal in the UK. One was concerning blood transfusions and the other concerning blood products. So we're going to be focusing on the blood products story. So people with haemophilia lack a protein in their blood needed to clot. So we're talking about haemophilia A and people who lack a protein called factor VIII. In the early 1970s, a revolutionary new treatment for haemophilia was created, which contained a concentrated form of that protein factor VIII, which you could then mix with distilled water, inject, and kind of boost your levels to then prevent blood clotting issues. So before this treatment, people with haemophilia found that, they would get intense internal bleeds. Their knees would swell, joints would kind of solidify. It was extremely painful and debilitating. The earlier treatments, fresh frozen plasma and cryoprecipitate, were full of impurities. So you would get a kind of small portion of factor VIII, but not enough, along with kind of other proteins and impurities that you didn't need. So before factor VIII came along, the treatment cryoprecipitate, you'd have to wait for it to thaw. It was frozen. So you're waiting for kind of a couple of hours while these painful bleeds are swelling your knee. And then when the treatment kind of goes in through infusion, it's very cold. And so it gives you a shock. Factor VIII could be kind of mixed at home, injected, and treat a bleed immediately. It could also be used prophylactically to prevent bleeds. So it really kind of changed the lives for young children, young adults with haemophilia, who had previously spent kind of years laying up on the sofa, missing weeks of school, and allowed them to kind of play football, play rugby, go rowing, really engage in activities that hadn't been available to them. But it came with a higher risk because factor VIII was made from pools of plasma. In America, those pools could reach tens of thousands, where cryoprecipitate was made from one, maybe up to a few donations. So you're suddenly amplifying the risk of viruses by tens of thousands for every donation that goes into that batch of factor VIII. And so just, I guess, to kind of fast forward for what that meant is we ended up in the UK with 1,250 people with haemophilia being infected with HIV, and up to 5,000 more with hepatitis C. And the death toll has reached hundreds over 1,000 of people in the UK.
Thank you. So what can you tell us about the recognition of the viruses and what was being done to study this in the new products, and what were the regulators doing?
So in the 70s, it became clear that factor VIII could transmit hepatitis. School children in Britain were kind of turning yellow, as they called it, and being sent to the hospital wing into isolation for a couple of weeks, being intensely sick, having jaundice. And that just became a kind of natural byproduct, like an accepted risk of treatment with factor VIII. And that had been a risk before. If you're being treated with cryoprecipitate, if a donor has hepatitis, you're going to contract hepatitis. But as I said, it was kind of amplified to the point that very soon every batch of factor VIII contained hepatitis. In the 70s, what doctors started to notice is that it was a more virulent form of hepatitis, which they hadn't identified before. So they started calling this non-A, non-B. Wasn't hepatitis A, wasn't hepatitis B. It was more kind of chronic and severe. We later came to know that as hepatitis C. But rather than kind of taking that as a warning of the dangers of factor VIII, doctors studied it. There was a nationwide hepatitis study where doctors were monitoring in the UK the kind of hepatitis risk in different batches of factor VIII. So they started looking at imported factor VIII from America made by commercial companies, and factor VIII made by the NHS from donors in the UK who weren't being paid, and found that hepatitis was more likely to be in the American version. But rather than then saying, well, let's stop using that, or let's kind of minimize use of that, the doctor said, we're going to now study the difference between the different brands. So we'll look at Bayer against Baxter. And patients didn't know that they had been enrolled on these studies, and that they were being given this product to see what the hepatitis risk was. When we get to the late 70s, early 80s, little known to doctors, there's a new virus in factor VIII, HIV. In July 1982, 3 patients in America contract AIDS-related symptoms, and the CDC says that this is a sign that they believe that AIDS is caused by a blood-borne agent, and isn't, there was lots of theories going around at the time of what was causing AIDS. Could it be a barrage of viruses seen in gay men? Could it be poppers that were popular among gay men? But these 3 cases in people with haemophilia kind of really jumped to the top of the pile, the idea that this was a blood-borne issue. But as we'll come on to that, we didn't jump on that news and change our practices.
Yeah, thank you. As this evidence was emerging, there were, as you mentioned, practices continuing that by today's standards for sure, and probably the standards of the day, should not have been going on. And some of these were at a place called the Treloar School, and I think that's something you've looked at in quite a lot of detail. Could you tell us about what happened there, please?
So Treloar School is kind of one of the notable parts of this scandal, just for kind of how awful it was, because they had a group of young boys with haemophilia. It's a condition that mostly affects boys, because it carries on the chromosome from mother to son, but it can affect women too. Women tend to be carriers, but they can also have symptoms themselves. But at this school, it was predominantly boys, and they've called themselves a captive audience. They were being treated by a 24-hour haemophilia centre on the school grounds. And this haemophilia centre, the doctors saw themselves as a leading research centre, because they had this group of patients in their care who they could monitor 24 hours a day. So they were helping kind of pioneer research into factor VIII, and that included the prophylactic treatment. So there was children who were, as young as 10, enrolled onto prophylactic studies, some being given placebos, some being given doses of factor VIII 2 times a week in order to kind of see how it prevented bleeds. But they and their parents weren't necessarily told. In some cases, there's a consent form saying your child might be used in research, but there's no kind of specificity. But the risk to these patients is the doctors are simultaneously conducting a hepatitis study. So they know factor VIII can transmit hepatitis, but they're doing prophylactic injections as another study. As the AIDS crisis develops, it becomes clear that the risk is much higher in American imported factor VIII because that is the epicenter of the AIDS crisis. And children should be treated more with NHS factor VIII to protect them. But that doesn't happen at Trelaws. The doctors continue to inject prophylactically, very regularly, with imported American factor VIII, which is highly likely to contain HIV. What we see then is a devastating cohort of young boys in their kind of early teens being diagnosed with HIV in 1985, and as was the kind of blanket terminology of the time, being told you've got a couple of years to live. And the kind of one thing that happened at the school is the way that children were told, the doctors kind of realized they had this mass scale issue on their hands, and they had to kind of suddenly give diagnoses to dozens of children. So they just pulled them in 5 at a time and went around the room and said, there's this new illness. We don't know a lot about it, but those who have it don't have very long to live. And then went around the room of boys and said, you have, you haven't, you have, you haven't, you have got HIV, HTLV3 as it would have been called then. And then the children were sent back to class with the weight of that diagnosis on their shoulders.
Yeah, very, very difficult story to hear, really. Now, your investigations helped to reveal that the factor VIII manufacturers bore a very large responsibility for making unsafe product. Would you like to say what we found out there?
Yeah, so as I touched upon, pharmaceutical companies in America were pooling tens of thousands of donations together. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which regulated blood products, imposed a very liberal limit on pool sizes, up to 100,000, where I think World Health Organization recommendations would have been, way under a dozen per batch. And so pharma companies were pooling these tens of thousands of donations, but really it was the plasma that went into those vats that made it highly risky. They were collecting paid for plasma because in America it's legal to pay donors for plasma, where in the UK and many other countries around the world that's deemed unethical. But in America they can be paid. So paying for donations, and they had centers that were being run in prisons. These lawyers that I have spoken to in great depth discovered this one prison in Louisiana, the farm, had a plasma center staffed by inmates who essentially could bribe one another to still donate even if they'd had hepatitis, which was a clear sign of someone that may be high risk of contracting HIV. Plasma donations were very lucrative in prison. You could get a carton of cigarettes for one donation, which was kind of great currency in a place where working backbreaking labor in the fields earned you a few cents. So it was high demand. That plasma was being combined with plasma collected from mobile trucks that were in nightlife districts in center of American cities that had AIDS kind of epidemics raging. Plasma brought from STD clinics, recovered plasma, and all of that kind of toxic mix was pooled together, and you just needed one infected donor for the whole batch to be contaminated. So by 1983, there's this horrifying kind of piece of evidence that was given in an American court case from a doctor who was actually very sympathetic and worked very closely with the pharma companies. He said that by 1983, it was highly likely that 100% of factor VIII manufactured in America contained HIV. So it was, the risks were amplified to such an awful degree. So it wasn't until AIDS emerged that the pharmaceutical companies properly started investing in ways to kill viruses in factor VIII. Before then, they deemed factor VIII to be too vulnerable to be heated or treated with chemicals, and that would kind of destroy batch yields. So they hadn't really properly invested in it. They find in 1984 that by heating factor VIII with a stabilizer, which we have been doing long before for albumin and other plasma products, you can melt the fatty casing around HIV and kind of denature the virus. So at that point, the factor VIII becomes safe from HIV. So they created this heat-treated product, which was safer, and they immediately kind of transitioned American patients over to this. But pharmaceutical companies not want to lose out on a profit, and they didn't want to bin all of the supplies that they had made. You know, it's very expensive to make, made from these tens of thousands of donations that they've paid for. And they had warehouses full of the older, dangerous version of factor VIII, and so they kept selling that abroad. And there are these company memos going well beyond 1985 into 1986, when patients around the world, thousands, tens of thousands of patients around the world have been diagnosed as HIV positive. And there are memos saying that we can keep, that AIDS is not a great topic of conversation in Taiwan and is unlikely to be so in the coming year. So we can keep selling the unheated version there. And the same goes on in Hong Kong, Israel, Taiwan, Japan. The UK, we try to fine line. Some doctors are like, I'm not treating my patients with that anymore. Some continue to use the older version. Some hospitals just have the older version in the kind of fridges, so keep using it. And Ken Clarke, the health minister, is very slow to come out and say we're going to stop using all unheated treatment. But so from July 1982 till sort of the end of 1985, there's years of patients being treated with very dangerous factor VIII, and it's a combination of kind of pharmaceutical misfeasance, government incompetence, and doctors at the end of what I call the poison line, stuck feeling like they have no choice but to treat the patients with the product they've got in their supplies.
Thank you. You raised the issue there that doctors faced a serious dilemma. They have patients they need to look after. They can't necessarily rely on the products they're receiving. And I think from what I've read, there were very different responses by different doctors, possibly even a spectrum of them. Could you share some of the the variation that you're mentioning?
Yeah, just to elaborate there, in the kind of the way I call my book, the poison line, is because of this idea of culpability. And I see the culpability largely resting with the pharma companies and then the politicians that allowed factor VIII to be imported, with the doctors at the very end of the line. So for me, they're making daily decisions of whether or not to treat patients, whether or not to tell patients of the risk of this treatment, to give them the informed choice of whether or not to have factor VIII. So it would be very easy to kind of fully blame the doctor who's been injecting patients. I have spoken to multiple doctors who said, I knew that I was injecting these patients with a risk of HIV. And that is something that kind of for the general public is very difficult to stomach. But I see the doctor's role as much more kind of complex, and it's very different to, I think the pharma companies are much more culpable than the doctors. But there were doctors who dismissed the risks, who kind of bought this line that from the pharma companies that there was no conclusive proof that AIDS was transmitted by blood, an agent in blood, and they would continue using the American product. There were doctors who had a cozy relationship with those pharma companies, enjoyed the incentives of using American factor VIII, such as kind of investment in their haemophilia center, kind of training trips for their staff members, and so continued to use that, as well as advising the government on kind of like, we should keep using this. But at the other end, there were doctors who switched to cryoprecipitate. This was one of the first big things that would have saved lives, as if we'd reverted to that older treatment. Yes, it was time consuming. It wasn't as effective as factor VIII, but it had dramatically increased life expectancy for people with haemophilia. And I think if patients had been given the choice, which they weren't, of this product could contain HIV, which currently comes with a death sentence, or this older treatment, which which isn't as effective, but is not going to give you HIV, then, I think there's a kind of clear choice there, but patients were not given that choice. There's some doctors as well who kind of like jumped on the heat treated factor VIII and kind of seized NHS factor VIII and said, we're not going to be using that American imported factor VIII anymore. But the kind of procurement and supply issue did reign. So it was difficult for them to make that decision to kind of cut off that dangerous version altogether. But then what you also see is another mistake that doctors made was after it became clear that patients had contracted HIV, not all doctors told their patients those diagnoses and that they were being tested for HIV straight away. So there's cases, I've spoken to people who lived for 4 years being HIV positive and their doctor knowing before their doctor told them, and discovering it because they started to become so ill that the doctor had no choice but to tell them. But in that time, they have got married, they've got a partner, they've been taking inordinate risks with their partner's health because they didn't know. And when they've sort of confronted their doctor, well, why didn't you tell me? That there's doctors have said, well, I didn't want to upset you because I knew that this was, going to come with this 2-year life expectancy, and I didn't want you to kind of have to live under that burden. So it's just across the board, there's kind of some very strange decisions made. There's also these unethical research trials, which we talked about at Trelaws, but those were going on nationwide. There was something called the HIV study of partners and wives, and doctors across the country, without telling patients, were monitoring whether a person with haemophilia who is HIV positive was able to pass that on to their wives and partners, but not being told. And so, it was really a time of confusion and chaos, but there was this paternalistic culture. So rather than informing patients and letting them make choices, then they often weren't.
In terms of culpability on your poison line, where does the UK government and the Department of Health stand? What were they doing at this time?
Yeah, so the Department of Health does not come out very well from this scandal. At the time, what you have is them buying the pharmaceutical company and the kind of doctor advice that to like couch the idea that AIDS is transmitted by a bloodborne agent. And so we really kind of like delay and delay. Ken Clarke, health minister, comes out and says there's no conclusive proof that AIDS is transmitted by a bloodborne agent. He says that for years, even after long after the CDC in America and other kind of notable institutes have said they believe it's bloodborne. The UK government is still saying there's no conclusive proof, and they hold that line well into 1984 until HTLV3 is discovered. Now that is the conclusive proof, but there has been much more scientific research and kind of studies that have indicated that it was bloodborne before then, not least patients in the UK with haemophilia showing signs of AIDS, which was suppressed. After the fact, the Department of Health does not invest properly in making the UK self-sufficient so that we can rely on our own stocks of safer factor VIII. That should have happened back in the 70s. Lord David Owen tried to implement self-sufficiency. He was kind of waving the flag and saying, this is going to be really risky, us using this factor VIII because of hepatitis and because of where these American companies are gathering factor VIII from, the plasma for factor VIII. But that kind of falls by the wayside. We never invest in self-sufficiency properly. So we never kind of make ourselves resilient to these risks. Then after the fact, we've had these delays, the lack of self-sufficiency, lack of investment, not educating the public. And then after the fact, when 1,250 people in the UK are diagnosed as HIV positive, the Department of Health embarks on a 30-year long cover-up. There's a HIV litigation which doesn't go to court. People with haemophilia are forced to sign a waiver that says they will not bring future legal action if they find out they have hepatitis C 6 months later, a test for hepatitis C is licensed, and turns out everyone treated with factor VIII has contracted hepatitis C. But they've now locked themselves out of being able to kind of get further compensation. As part of the HIV litigation, people received around £20,000. And it's largely deemed that the figure was so low because it was thought everyone would die in the next few years of AIDS-related illness. So they didn't need ongoing support money, which is just kind of disgusting, really, when you think about it. The Department of Health kind of keeps with this line that everything was done as it could have been at the time, nothing could have been done differently. There's no scandal to see here. But documents are destroyed. Ministers are given false information when they join the Department of Health, and we get to a point where you have from both sides, Jeremy Hunt and Andy Burnham, two former health ministers, both say that they were lied to about what had happened with infected blood. Jeremy Hunt said the state sometimes closes ranks around a lie, and that's what happened in this case. And Andy Burnham said this was a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale.
Yeah, the difficult situation to comprehend in a way. Now, there have been several inquiries into the infected blood scandal. Can you tell us, what happened from those inquiries?
Yeah, so in the UK, we've been very slow to deal with this issue. There was the first inquiry, the Archer inquiry, was kind of long fought by a few select kind of lords and ministers and campaigners who kind of knew that what had happened to them was wrong and had got hold of information that kind of started to indicate that much more had been known about their illnesses before they had ever been given an indication of what was coming and what had happened. But the Archer inquiry was highly critical of our response to the risks of factor VIII and the aftermath and the infections, but it didn't have statutory powers, it couldn't call ministers, and it had no way to compel the government to listen to its findings. And so although it was highly critical and recommended compensation, the government just ignored it. We then, in 2015, had the Penrose inquiry in Scotland. Again, it couldn't compel Westminster ministers to attend. Lord Penrose did comb through evidence. His report is it was described as a doorstop. It's kind of like hefty document, but at the end of the day, it makes one recommendation to test anyone who received a blood transfusion before 1991, I believe, for hepatitis C, something which still hasn't been done to this day. And campaigners kind of deemed it a whitewash. They said that it because they couldn't comb through the Department of Health evidence, speak to those ministers, they didn't gather the wealth of documentation needed. So it wasn't critical. So then campaigners kind of pushed and pushed, and in 2017, Theresa May announced the infected blood inquiry, which concluded in May this year, and it is a damning indictment of what happened. Sir Brian Langstaff said the UK should never have licensed factor VIII from America to be imported into the UK back in the 70s. If we had kind of stopped the poison line at that point, no one here would have, there would have been very, very few, if any, cases of HIV among people with haemophilia. Hepatitis rates would have also been lower. He kind of damned the cover-up, the lack of candor that our health service showed, the Department of Health, and how that had compounded the trauma of victims here over the years, and the sort of terrible treatment they have had in both being given these life-limiting chronic illnesses and then the way they've kind of been mistreated as well. So finally, that felt like a moment of kind of victory for those campaigners, that they have fought for 35 years, not just fighting these illnesses, but then kind of fighting the government. And they have reached this point finally that there was a sense of kind of catharsis at the closing of Brian Langstaff's report.
And is that the final solution to the problem, or are the victims now being looked after? What's the situation?
So compensation's the big thing, and it is kind of like the wheels are turning. There was a lot of fear that it wasn't going to happen because 2 days after, well, a day after he apologized, no, 2 days after, on the Monday, Sir Brian Langstaff released his report and Rishi Sunak apologized. On the Tuesday, it was announced that there would be compensation. On the Wednesday, the election was called. And so all the kind of conversation and momentum that had come behind the infected blood scandal, it felt like the rug was pulled from underneath them. So, but I think with the new government, the wheels are sort of in motion. People do feel like it's kind of ticking in the right direction, but it's slow progress, and there's a lot of fear and anxiety because of how they've been treated over the years that it's still not going to happen. The government is still kind of looking at Sir Brian's recommendations, and among them, I think, are things that we've spoken a lot about, not just in the infected blood scandal, but wider in the NHS, of this duty of candour, creating kind of a safety system that's a bit more like the aviation industry, where we learn from mistakes, improve off the back of them, and prevent them from happening again. And this kind of reform that I actually think we see replicated across the board, with when you think of like maternity unit health scandals, other health issues, there's a kind of idea that the management tries to kind of close it down, scapegoat, underplay, rather than being open and honest and trying to learn from a mistake.
I've come to my final question, which is also a cue for our audience to start typing their questions into the Q&A if they'd like to. And that is, we've very much focused today on the UK, but clearly this was a global issue. Could you give us an insight into what happened in other countries? Did they deal with it the same way or in a better way?
So before the infections, there's countries that kind of are a good example of what we could have done, such as Belgium, Finland, who were self-sufficient and did not import blood products, and the cases of HIV are negligible there. After the fact, we have been interminably slow and embarked on this cover-up, whereas in America, there was a decade of kind of lawsuits and congressional reports, which ended up with everyone receiving $100,000 from Congress and $100,000 from pharmaceutical companies. And then one kind of small cohort of people that wouldn't accept the settlement from the pharmaceutical companies receiving $100 million between 124 families. So there was one case where a jury decided that the pharmaceutical company is kind of guilty of negligence and fraud here, and the damages were $54 million. So that gives you a sense of maybe the true scale of damages, which will never be recognized for each individual person, because this is tens of thousands of people around the world. Canada held an inquiry very quickly and very thoroughly. By 1997, the Crever report had been published, and it was a damning indictment. It led to a reform of Canada's blood system, compensation for victims, and that really is kind of a marker of how we should have dealt with this. The same happened in Ireland in the early 2000s, that building on the Crever report. So you find on the island of Ireland, you find, if you're in the south, people who have been compensated, apologized to, and given ongoing support now for life, and people in the north who have been fighting for 30 years and received kind of a handful of scraps of money support over the years. And that just gives you the kind of stark difference of how poorly we've dealt with this. France and Japan ended up sending people to jail, doctors in France and pharmaceutical executives in Japan. So that's kind of far end of how this could have been dealt with, and actually kind of acknowledging the mistakes made and the damage caused.
Thank you for that. I wonder, from your own point of view as a journalist, how challenging was it to get hold of official documents? You know, in terms of historical work, we can go to archives, etc. What was the main source of your information?
Well, it's been a great help for me to have been doing this concurrently with the infected blood inquiry, because they have been releasing swathes of documents as they've gone. And that is a great resource. Everything is documented and catalogued online still, so you can go and read everything that the inquiry has looked at. I mean, it's tough searching, but you find your way through, and you can go and read decisions that were made, how they were taken. On the US side, I was very lucky that the lawyers I was working with there made a digital database of all of the documents from their court cases. And so that involved all of the pharmaceutical company memos, kind of marketing plans, which outlined how they were going to continue selling the AIDS infected product abroad. So I've kind of been lucky to have those two online resources maybe. And so I didn't spend much time kind of going through the National Archives. But also there are, there's victims, people infected themselves, people whose parents are infected and have passed away, who have spent years of their lives trawling through the archives and also been unearthing information. They've really kind of taken this on as an unpaid second job. And that's a big reason that we know so much. And their evidence was then put into the inquiry. So it's been kind of a lot of work from a lot of people to really kind of chip away and uncover the final truth of what happened.
Okay, thank you so much. We've actually run out of time, and I'm sure you've answered plenty of questions in this session. So, Cara, thank you for a wonderful insight into a very difficult situation that's affected many, many lives. Thank you very much. Much appreciated for your time. Okay, so I would now like to welcome the final contributor to this session. Dan Healy is Professor Emeritus of Modern Russian History at the University of Oxford. He's an expert on the social and cultural history of modern Russia and the Soviet Union, and has several books to his name. Dan's most recent work is The Gulag Doctors: Life, Death and Medicine in Stalin's Labour Camps. Today, he's going to take us inside the medical world of Stalin's Gulag.
Right, let me just share my screen. There we are. How does that look? Is that fine? Great. Thank you very much, Edward, for that introduction, and what wonderful papers we've heard already. They're really fascinating. I also want to thank the Society for this invitation. In August 1949, in Leningrad's Military Medical Academy, the qualifying examinations for physicians were underway when one candidate, Vadim Alexandrovsky, was arrested. The secret police detained him discreetly, and his comrades only guessed that he had been arrested because no marks were posted next to his name on the results board as the week-long cycle of examinations continued. Alexandrovsky, 25 years old and from an intelligentsia family, was accused of anti-Soviet agitation and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Very quickly, he was transported to the timber production labor camps of Archangel province. Naturally, the lieutenant paramedic was distressed for being separated from his pregnant wife and family, but also because his chance to qualify as a doctor was interrupted by his arrest. Nevertheless, the next 6 years saw the young enemy of the people serve in the labor camp medical service, the Gulag Sanitary Department, or Sanodel. His forced labor took place not in the forests cutting trees, but in camp clinics diagnosing and treating prisoner patients. By the end of his sentence, Vadim Alexandrovsky could say he was standing on my own 2 feet as a doctor. He learned how to adapt the methodical textbook routines of medical practice he had learned in the highly prestigious Military Medical Academy to the peculiar clinical setting of the penal system, with its specific prisoner-patient population and its harsh values and priorities. The Gulag Medical Service turned out to be a brutal but effective postgraduate education for the would-be physician. After release, he got his qualification and he practiced as a physician, writing his Gulag memoir in 1989. Alexandrovsky was one of thousands of Gulag doctors. of whom about 40% were prisoners. And he found himself in a gray zone occupational group inside the camps, in Gulag slang called the trustees. Prisoners who worked in the gray zone occupations did not do harsh manual general labor in forests, mines, and construction sites, but worked in more privileged settings like hospitals, offices, and warehouses. These prisoner engineers, technicians, and medical personnel had better rations, barracks, and supplies than ordinary prisoners. Yet they were still not free workers and could lose their privileges at any time. Commandants could send them to work in general labor for breaking rules or challenging authority. Next slide, please. These gray zone prisoner doctors and mid-level medical staff worked alongside freely hired medical personnel with challenging consequences for their clinical collaboration. Freely hired doctors, nurses, paramedics, and other specialists were recruited by a variety of means to work in the Gulag medical system. Some were attracted by higher salaries and a range of incentives to work for the Gulag. Others joined as a result of graduate job assignment, and their very first patients were prisoners, not free civilians. Such inexperienced physicians and medical staff were often given great responsibility in the Sanodel, managing hospitals or networks of clinics. The question of medical care in the Gulag has not received much scholarly attention. Next slide, please. The great historian of the Gulag, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, dismissed the medical service provided in the camps as evil. He wrote, like every branch of the camp administration, the medical section too was born of the devil and filled with the devil's blood. Solzhenitsyn spent 8 years in the Gulag, including time in its hospitals for treatment of a tumor, and it's natural that he saw the camp clinics as inadequate. His huge masterwork, the Gulag Archipelago, comments very briefly and disparagingly about the work of doctors and medical services. He blames a fellow Gulag survivor and writer, Varlam Shalamov, for propagating a legend about the benign camp medical section. Shalamov spent 14 years in the camps and survived because he was trained as a paramedic in the medical service there. As a result, Shalamov's famous documentary fiction about the Gulag, Kolyma Tales, devoted more space to depictions of medical life behind barbed wire. Nevertheless, he acknowledged the peculiar pressures prisoner and free doctors worked under because of the penal setting. Modern historians have been reluctant to explain Gulag medicine. Most have found it confusing and contradictory. How could a system that notoriously exploited the labor of prisoners to the point of exhaustion, starvation, and frequently death also have places of healing, warm hospital wards, clean beds, and better nutrition? The answer to this puzzle lies in the fact that Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans allocated prisoners to the secret police as a cheap labor force that could be used to colonize remote places around the Soviet Union. The Gulag built industries, mines, and transportation links for the wider socialist economy. In the view of the secret police, the camps needed their medical sections not to save individual prisoners from dying, but to preserve the economic productivity of the police empire's workforce. The official values of the medical section were not Hippocratic, but Soviet. The Gulag Sanodel was tasked with preventing epidemics, curing illness, and treating injuries, and also with refeeding malnourished but savable prisoners for the sake of production targets. The Sanodel's mission was therefore significantly different from the medical institutions found in the Nazi German concentration and death camps. Next slide, please. Unlike the Nazi camps, the Soviet Gulag lasted for decades, and the main camp complexes evolved into industrial towns and cities built by prisoners. Nazi camps were comparatively ephemeral, and their contribution to the German economy was short-lived and incidental. The purpose of the Nazi camps was determined by an ideology dictating the annihilation of racial enemies, yielding survival rates of just under 50%. Medicine in the Nazi camps was subordinated to this ideology, with infamous results in the criminal experimentation on and torture of prisoners by Nazi doctors. The Soviet forced labor camps under Stalin exhausted and starved many millions of prisoners, but approximately 85% survived, according to the most recent rigorous estimates. We know that Soviet camp commandants manipulated their death rates, monitored by Moscow, by discharging sick prisoners so that they would die outside the labor camp gates. Yet the ideology of the Soviet camps claimed to reforge prisoners into new Soviet persons and productive workers. The deep and enduring integration of the Soviet camps into the national economy meant that they had a different medical ethos to the Nazi camps. Yevgenia Ginsburg, a prisoner nurse in the Far Eastern gold mining camps of Kolyma, found herself treating a German prisoner patient suspected of having been an SS officer during the war. When the officer, deranged from remorse, begged her to kill him using a syringe, she told him, "You're mad. We're not fascists. We don't murder our patients. We treat them." In this talk, I'll examine some fundamental questions about the purpose and practice of Gulag medicine, based on my study of doctors' memoirs, Central Moscow and local Gulag archives, and materials from the regional history museums of cities founded by the Gulag. First, I discuss the purposes of Gulag medicine and the typical illnesses of labor camp life. Then I'll examine the extent of the medical infrastructure inside the Gulag and the ways in which doctors were recruited into this gray zone occupation. Finally, I discuss the practice of medicine in the penal setting. What limits to clinical freedom operated inside the camp medical system? How did freely hired and prisoner doctors interact? Medicine and doctors for Stalin's Gulag. The provision of medical care to prisoners had been part of the Tsarist regime's ambitions, but resources fell far below need in both the urban prisons of old Central Russia and in the penal camps of Siberian hard labor. In 1917, or after 1917, the revolutionary Soviet communist regime innovated by establishing a health ministry separate from the Interior Ministry for the first time. However, its infamous secret police, the so-called Cheka, later the NKVD, and finally the KGB, had an embedded medical service subordinate to the security apparatus, not civilian healthcare officials. The secret police had its own network of concentration camps, eventually which became the Gulag. Inside these camps, doctors answered both to the disciplinary power of medical bureaucrats, managers, and experts, and to the sovereign power of camp commandants, guards, work assignment managers, and security police. The essence of Gulag medicine lies in this dual subordination of the doctor and prisoner care to two forms of authority. Doctors made judgments based on medical science and clinical practice, but they worked within a unique institutional framework that limited their professional autonomy. The Gulag expanded rapidly across the Soviet Union during dictator Joseph Stalin's rule from the 1930s to the 1950s, building new mines, industries, and towns to exploit the prisoners' forced labor. From under 200,000 prisoners in 1930, the Gulag held 2.5 million prisoners by the time of Stalin's death in 1953. The vast majority of the Gulag population were adult males of working age. Women constituted less than 10 to 25% of the population. Outside the camps, this should have been a healthy group. However, the Gulag's forced labor and work for rations system exhausted many prisoners, leading to emaciation, diseases of malnutrition, and death. Tuberculosis, starvation disease known as alimentary dystrophy, pellagra, scurvy, typhus, circulatory and respiratory diseases were widespread. Industrial injuries were common across the work sites of the Gulag. Limbs were lost in mines and in timber cutting camps, and prisoners were exposed to dangerous substances, with silicosis being particularly virulent in Gulag facilities. Safety measures that were already primitive in Soviet civilian industry were hardly provided at all in the Gulag, and enforcement of safety was negligent. Violence inflicted by guards and other prisoners was commonplace. Self-mutilation to escape hard labor was also practiced widely. Gulag doctors were often required to repair the damage caused by the Gulag environment itself. Due to the scarcity of drugs and medical supplies, the main form of treatment was often simple hospitalization. With bed rest, clean surroundings, and regular food, a prisoner exhausted by hard labor might be restored sufficiently to be sent back to production. Next slide, please. The Gulag leadership needed the medical sections not to preserve individual prisoner health, but to maintain the economic output of this police empire. The Gulag sanitary department was justified not by person-centered Hippocratic values, which were still widely understood by Soviet doctors, but collective Soviet ones. A vast penal industrial empire needed medicine to protect the empire's production from falling due to a loss of labor capacity, as the Sanatdel's bureaucracy described illness and mortality among prisoners. In fact, the Gulag Sanatdel's collectivist production focus was an extreme version of civilian healthcare distribution in the Soviet Union. While medical care was one of the constitutional rights of the Soviet citizen, Soviet health services in civilian life were deployed highly selectively in the 1930s through to the 1950s, with civilian resources concentrated on priority industries and cities. Stalinist medical priorities were production-focused, collective rather than individualized, and most importantly, unashamedly unequal. The Gulag Sanatdel found doctors, paramedics, and nurses through a variety of channels. About 40 to 50% of the 10,000 medical staff in 1939 were prisoners, and the rest were freely hired or contract employees of the secret police. Intellectuals arrested on faked political charges predominated among the prisoners working in the medical system. Their forced labor was not in mines or cutting down trees, but in clinics and hospitals. They could be sent to hard general labor at any time at the commandant's discretion. Freely hired staff were usually recruited from graduating classes of physicians, paramedics, and nurses. Salaries and benefits were much better than in civilian medicine. The medical profession became predominantly female in the 1930s in the Soviet Union, and inexperienced graduate contract doctors working for the Gulag found themselves managing hospitals and medical sections. They supervised prisoner doctors, sometimes medical professors from Moscow and Leningrad, who were usually male. The normal hierarchies of gender, education, and experience were inverted inside the camps. What did these doctors do, and what was medical care like behind barbed wire? Medical practice in the penal setting. The core objective of the Gulag camp system, as I've said, was to squeeze hard labor from the prisoners to fulfill production targets, and all medical priorities were subject to this primary imperative. In such an environment, it becomes easy to understand Solzhenitsyn's mistrust of the medical section. Next slide, please. Despite this, not all Gulag medical staff lacked humanity and sympathy for their prisoner patients. Many doctors struggled to balance the professional impulse to heal the individual patient with their duties as free or prisoner personnel serving the penal network. The camp's commandants and their industrial managers, however, set crucial limits to the clinical freedom of Sanatdel doctors. when in 1949, the prisoner Dr. Vadim Alexandrovsky began working for his first outpatient clinic in the camps, he was shocked by how different clinical work was from the training at Leningrad's prestigious military medical academy. He suddenly felt his education seemed extremely distant from real life, all the more from labor camp life. He described his first clinic vividly, and this is a quotation. The reception worked at a furious pace. At the third camp subdivision, one of the doctors or paramedics I have mentioned would preside. Stethoscopes were rarely used, and seldom were the usual methods of diagnostics employed. The camp doctors developed a subtle feeling. Which patient should one treat seriously, and which one should simply be asked, what's wrong? Vasya, give him something for his stomach or head or chest. With serious patients, they acted like a proper doctor, but always at a fast pace. Whoever needed it was sent to the infirmary or given a minor operation right there in the bandaging station, draining abscesses, sewing up minor wounds, extracting teeth, giving injections, and so on. Sterilization and asepsis were quite relative, not because the doctors forgot about them, but because of the primitive conditions in general, end quote. Alexandrovsky soon learned that to be effective, doctors in the Gulag needed to work quickly and understand the specific diseases presented by prisoner patients and the potential therapy available. Saving hospital beds by performing on-the-spot minor procedures was essential. Doctors had a quota for hospitalization of prisoner workers, and camp authorities warned and punished doctors who exceeded the quota. Some prisoner patients merited serious attention, but the malingerers, pleaders, the self-harmers, as he wrote, were quickly dispatched. Soon, Alexandrovsky learned to recognize when a prisoner, emaciated by labor, had deteriorated to the point where they could be given a temporary stay in the hospital or a convalescent station for treatment and refeeding. He noted, quote, "We weren't taught this way in the academy," end quote. The young prisoner doctor was soon trusted to run his own clinics in isolated camp subdivisions. He benefited from mentorship and strict supervision by his ex-prisoner boss, a dental technician who had risen to become the head of the camp sanitya. Next slide, please. Freely hired doctors also had to adjust to the specific ways that medicine was conducted in the Gulag. Their medical authority was broader, and the camp authorities trusted their political loyalty. Moscow instructed commandants of the camps how to handle youthful graduates arriving to work in their first jobs in the camps, to warn them about association with the prisoners, to give them opportunities for professional development, and to encourage the best among them to join the Communist Party. Yet these free doctors also had to face hungry and exhausted prisoners, quotas for hospitalization, and limited supplies and equipment. One freely hired doctor was Nina Savoyeva, who finished Moscow Medical Institute in 1940 and immediately accepted a posting to the Kolyma gold mining camps. She was promoted to medical school by Soviet affirmative action principles. As a female North Ossetian peasant, she had joined the Young Communist League, which offered upward mobility to disadvantaged social and national groups. Savoyeva's medical professionalism often put her on a collision course with camp authorities. She writes, conflicts with the bosses started almost from the very first day. In her 1996 memoir, I Chose Kolyma, she writes this. Savoyeva nearly doubled the rates of work release permits issued to prisoner patients in her first clinic at a remote gold mine and enraged the production managers at her camp. In this first Gulag job, she embarked on a series of battles for patient health, trying to release more prisoners from hard labor and improve sanitation. Savoyeva's confrontations led to a nervous collapse. She was given a 2-week rest break at a hot springs spa belonging to the Gulag in Kolyma, and then reassigned with almost no managerial experience to run a central camp hospital as its chief doctor. There, she was mentored by more experienced prisoner physicians like Pyotr Kalambet. Kalambet like Savoyeva, had been promoted from his peasant background to a physician's training, but he had over a decade's clinical experience before his arrest in some prestigious diplomatic postings. Mentoring by older prisoner doctors of younger free doctors was widespread. Professional solidarity was powerful in the Gulag hospital, despite the presence of informants and the ideology of suspicion based on imagined political disloyalty. Many of the free doctors were greatly outnumbered in the institutions they ran. Savoyeva was the only free physician in the hospital she ran. Alexandrovsky's boss, the chief of his camp, Sanodel, relied almost entirely on prisoner doctors to staff the geographically scattered camp subdivision clinics that he oversaw. A degree of trust between the two groups was essential to the smooth running of medical facilities. So to conclude, the next slide, please. The Gulag's medical sections were certainly, as Solzhenitsyn argued, creatures of the labor camp system that hosted them. My research into the biographies of the people who staffed it and the forms of medicine they practiced leads me to disagree with his assessment that all medical care in the Gulag was negligent and complicit with evil. Rather, the nature of medical professional solidarity and routines of clinics and hospitals allowed for at least some humanity. Despite the Soviet and collectivist values of this medical system, individual doctors confronted individual prisoner patients, and the chance to treat disease was potentially a Hippocratic moment for patient and doctor. I've not had time today to discuss the careers of Gulag doctors after the Gulag was reformed in the 1950s, and many doctors transferred to civilian medicine. Many ex-prisoner doctors eventually wrote their memoirs during Russia's brief democratic era of the late 1980s and into the 1990s. These memoirs testify to a varied career path after penal medicine. Some remained in the towns that the Gulag built to become respected senior practitioners in their specialisms. My book describes how physicians, psychiatrists, physiotherapists, and other specialists acquired unusual expertise through Gulag medicine and were later honored as founders of medical services in their regions. Others chose to return to central districts and resume practice, often in a different hometown or institution than the one that they had left. Post-Stalin memory politics were unpredictable, and most chose to remain silent about their labor camp past. The freely hired doctors, like those in this photograph, had all signed non-disclosure agreements with the secret police. They enjoyed prosperous careers after Stalin's death, but as a group, they did not write memoirs or speak to journalists or historians. The history of medical care in the Soviet Union is still little understood by scholars and historians, but it cannot be told without the story of Soviet labor camp medicine. Thank you very much.
Dan, thank you so much for giving us such a detailed insight into a medical system acting under very unusual and severe constraints. I ask again the audience to put towards the Q&A any questions they may have. If I may start, Dan, was the access to medicines in the camps similar to what might have been found outside, or was it difficult to get hold of the materials that were needed to treat patients?
It's a very good question. There are two sides to this. First of all, a lot of these camps were in extremely remote areas without conventional forms of transport. So supply lines were extreme. For example, the Norilsk nickel mining camp, which was beyond the Arctic Circle, was only accessible except by air for about 5 months of the year through river navigation. And so food supplies could be interrupted by that, and medical supplies as well. Some of my informants, like Anna Klyashko, whose photograph is in the slide, I interviewed her in Montreal in the 2010s. she saw a decent range of medicines, a surprising range of medicines in Colima in the 1940s and early 1950s, including penicillin. But she did work mostly in the civilian service as opposed to the prisoner service. And so supplies for prisoners were much more limited. And quite often, the scientific basis for many of the nutritional diseases that these prisoners suffered from was well known by this time, and yet the supplies were not there to fix the problem.
Thank you. I'll move to the Q&A now. Were the nutritional deficiencies you mentioned systemic and deliberate, or due to local factors?
Well, certainly systemic. Deliberate is impossible to determine from the paper trails left by the Gulag. Although I have a colleague, Golfo Alexopoulos, who's written about the central administration of the medical service, and she argues that this was deliberate, the malnutrition was deliberate. I would probably agree with that and say as well, and point out as well, that the Gulag was at the bottom of a list of priorities in the Soviet state. And if you look at the work, for example, wonderful historical medical work that Donald Filzer has done, looking at civilian life during and after the Second World War in the Soviet Union, you see that vast swathes of the Soviet population in freedom were also being denied the basics of nutrition, essentially, and sanitation, and that they were dying in unwarranted numbers due to tuberculosis and other malnutrition-related diseases.
Thank you. You mentioned TB being a problem in the camps. Do we have an idea how many doctors or medical personnel may have died in the camps?
Well, they were certainly exposed to TB in the camps because that was a major killer, and quite often TB patient prisoners were isolated in specific wards. The infectious ward was a separate unit in these mid-century hospitals, and so they would have been exposed and certainly would have died. We don't have any idea of the numbers of medical personnel who died on the job, but we can expect it was fairly high, and we can also expect that prisoner personnel were more likely to die because they often had to do the dirtier jobs in the hospitals, so I can put it like that. The ones where they're exposed more regularly to infection.
Okay, thank you. And we have one final question. Could you say something more about how you did the research and the resources that you used?
I was very fortunate to get support from the Wellcome Trust and later on the Leverhulme for my research. And I conducted most of the research in the early 2000s, before President Putin came back to power in 2012, in other words. And at that point, I was able to travel to some of the Gulag-built cities and use the resources, mostly of museums, actually. There's a wonderful history of medicine museum in the city of Ukhta, which is a kind of oil production center built by the Gulag in the 1930s. And its history of medicine museum is really a history of the development of medicine in a Gulag town. So they were a first port of call for me, but many other museums in that region, and also in Colima, in Magadan, the city of Magadan, were very forthcoming in 2009, in 2011, when I went and visited them with materials for me. And those I matched and married up with materials I was able to gather from the Moscow archives of the Gulag administration. I also looked at the archives of the People's Commissariat of Public Health in Russia and in Georgia, just to triangulate things nicely.
That's great. Thank you so much. We're out of time. Really appreciate your contribution today. And I'm sure that all our audience will like to join me in thanking all three of our presenters for their excellent presentations, for sticking so well to time, and for being prepared to join us on today's live webinar.